16 women stood where she stood, felt what she felt, and walked away shaking. Not because he touched them, not because he threatened them, but because of what they saw up close. When Mira ran straight into the Alpha King and didn't recoil, the question wasn't why she stayed. It was what everyone else had been too afraid to name. If this story is already pulling at you, I need your help. Most of you watch without subscribing, and that makes it nearly impossible to keep creating. Hit subscribe. It's free and takes 2 seconds. Comment where you're watching from so I know you're real. Now back to the story. The rain had turned the palace corridors into a maze of shadows and echoing stone. Through the vaulted passageways, a figure in white cut through the darkness. Mira, small and soaked, ran until her lungs screamed. Hunters closed in behind her, men who saw her not as a person but as property to be reclaimed. Her feet were cut raw from gravel roads and cobblestone, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror of the bonded servitude she'd just escaped. She turned sharply down a corridor she didn't recognize, lined with ancient stones and burning torches that cast more shadow than light. Her vision blurred. Her legs faltered. And then she collided with something immovable. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. But before she could fall, a hand caught her arm, large, steady, impossibly controlled, and held her upright with strength that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't. Slowly, she looked up the broad expanse of a rain-slicked chest, up past shoulders that seemed carved from something more permanent than flesh, up into the face of Alaric Vane. Even in the dim torchlight, he was overwhelming. Not in the way of violence, but in the way of mountains, present, undeniable, impossible to ignore. His dark hair clung to his jaw, soaked from the storm. His eyes held hers for a beat too long. This was the Alpha King, the man no woman had ever successfully chosen. Please.
I'll do anything.
The word tore from her throat. She pressed her hand against his chest and whispered again,
I'll do anything.
desperate and raw.
Let them take me
Please. I'll do anything. Just don't let them take me back. Alaric's jaw tightened. His hand on her arm shifted, more deliberate, as if he were deciding something that mattered. And in that moment, he realized something he'd never allowed himself to believe, that maybe his strength wasn't a flaw. Maybe it had been waiting for someone who needed a wall to stand behind instead of someone who needed him to be smaller. There. 3 figures burst into the corridor, boots pounding stone. Hunters. The lead man pulled up short when he saw the king. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. That Omega is a runaway from the Dorian estates. Bonded servitude contract. Legally owned. Hand her over, and we'll be gone. Alaric didn't move. He didn't even look at them. His gaze remained fixed on the woman trembling beneath his hand, feeling the frantic rhythm of her pulse through her wrist. This woman, he said, his voice low and resonant, sought sanctuary in my house. He took 1 step forward, drawing Mira behind him. His frame eclipsed the torchlight. His shadow swallowed them whole. In this kingdom, the king's presence is law. You are standing in it. Your Majesty, the law of ownership. Leave. The word was quiet, devastating, absolute. The hunters fled, their boots echoing until silence reclaimed the space. Alaric turned slowly, expecting what always came next. The recoil, the invented distance, the careful politeness that meant I need to leave now. But Mira didn't move away. She stood there, chest heaving, rain dripping from her hair, staring at him with eyes that should have been afraid but weren't.
She saw the strength, yes,
But she also saw the way his shoulders angled slightly inward, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. The way his hands remained open and visible. The way he kept careful distance even now, as if he expected her to need it. As if he'd learned to apologize for existing. Mira took one trembling step forward. She placed her hand over his heart. It beat slow and steady beneath her palm. "I don't see what they saw," she said, barely above a whisper but clear and unflinching. "I see someone who's been made to feel like too much his entire life. And I think they were wrong." Alaric's breath caught. For the first time in 10 years, since the first rejection, since the first woman who could meet his eyes, something cracked open inside his chest. He felt seen. Mira woke to softness. The bed beneath her was down and linen, warm and clean. Golden morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating a chamber so vast it could have held her entire childhood home. Then she saw him. Alaric sat across the room in a chair by the door, hands folded in his lap, shoulders curved forward despite their width. He'd placed himself where he'd be visible the moment she woke. No surprises, no proximity, no reason for alarm. "You're safe," he said quietly. "I give you my word. No one enters these rooms without my permission." Mira pushed herself upright, wincing as pain shot through her feet. The movement drew his attention, and something shifted in his expression, controlled fury mixed with something gentler. "May I?" He gestured toward her injuries. She nodded. Alaric crossed the room and knelt before the bed. A king on his knees for a runaway Omega with no name and no future. He reached for a basin of warm water and clean cloth, then carefully lifted her foot into his hands. They were large, scarred, calloused from years of sword work and governance. But they moved with impossible gentleness, cleaning cuts and wrapping bandages as if she were something fragile and worth protecting. Mira's breath caught when she saw his knuckles. Old wounds, some healed poorly, some still faint with bruising. "Who hurt you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. His hands stilled. A bitter laugh rumbled from his chest. "Everyone." Eventually. The silence felt heavy but not uncomfortable. It felt like the kind of quiet where truth could finally breathe. And then Mira began to talk. She told him about her family, about the bonded servitude contract, about the Dorian estate and the way Omegas were categorized and traded, about the nights locked in holding rooms, about the moment she realized no one was coming to free her, so she freed herself. As she spoke, the windows began to rattle. A low sound built in Alaric's chest, something that vibrated through the floor and made the air feel charged. His jaw clenched. His hands trembled with controlled fury. Mira placed her hand over his fist, feeling the tension coiled beneath. "I'm not afraid of you," she said clearly. "I've seen real monsters. You're not one." Alaric looked up at her, and something in his expression cracked. "They told you I was, though, didn't they?" Mira held his gaze. "They told me a lot of things that turned out to be lies." Over the days that followed, Mira learned to read the language of restraint. Alaric never entered a room without announcing himself first. When he moved, he did so slowly, deliberately, as if each gesture required approval. He positioned himself near exits, never blocking doorways. When they spoke, he kept his hands visible, resting on chair arms or folded in his lap. He made himself an open book, every page turned toward her in advance. "You don't have to do that," she said one afternoon, watching him pause in the doorway before stepping inside. "I'm not going to run." His smile was faint, tired. "They all said that." She saw it then. The way he held his shoulders slightly hunched, the way he angled his body to take up less space despite his size. It wasn't natural. It was learned, practiced. A man who'd spent years making himself smaller so others wouldn't have to feel small. What did they see? Mira asked quietly. Really? Alaric was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated rejections. Intensity. Something they couldn't control or predict. I think. He paused, searching for words. I think they saw someone who would see too much of them in return, who wouldn't look away when it was convenient. A memory flickered across his face. One woman told me I made her feel exposed, not physically, emotionally, like I could see every doubt she'd ever hidden. His jaw tightened, so I learned to look away first, to give them space before they needed to take it. Mira understood. She'd spent years being looked through, not at. Owners who saw inventory. Handlers who saw labor. People who made her feel invisible while holding her paperwork. I know what it's like, she said, to have people decide who you are before you open your mouth. To be reduced to something manageable. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Recognition. Not of similarity, but of parallel wounds. His from being too visible, hers from being rendered invisible. Both controlled by other people's fear. You keep waiting for me to leave, Mira said suddenly, the realization settling over her like cold water. Every time you walk into a room, you're already preparing for me to ask you to go. Alaric didn't deny it. He simply stood there, shoulders curved inward, hands open, waiting for the inevitable rejection he'd learned to expect. Tell me about the others, Mira said one evening as rain drummed against the windows. Alaric leaned back in his chair, gaze distant. Lady Celeste was kind. She apologized for 3 days before finally admitting she couldn't sleep knowing I was in the next room. Not because I'd done anything, because she kept imagining what I might do. He paused. Lady Thorne laughed. Said I was too much man for any woman to handle. Made it sound like a joke, but her hands shook when she signed the refusal papers. They weren't all cruel, he continued quietly. Most were simply unprepared. They'd been raised on stories about alphas, dominance, possession, loss of control. When they met me, their fear filled in details that didn't exist. Mira leaned forward. But their fear doesn't make it true. Just because they couldn't see past their own myths doesn't mean you're what they imagined. Doesn't it? Alaric's voice carried years of weight. 16 women, Mira. At what point does the pattern become the truth? At no point, she said firmly. Truth isn't determined by consensus. Before he could respond, a knock interrupted them. A counselor entered with careful deference, delivering a message about the High Council's growing concerns regarding succession. The words were diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. The king's continued isolation was becoming a political problem. After the counselor left, Alaric's expression darkened. It's beginning, he said quietly. That night, word spread through the palace that Lady Celeste had returned to court after 5 years of silence. She carried letters, testimonies from other rejected women. Suddenly, what had been private humiliation was becoming public record. The whispers were no longer about sympathy. They were about stability, about whether a king rejected by every woman was fit to rule at all. Someone had turned his loneliness into a weapon. The High Council convened without ceremony. Their language had shifted from concern to accusation. Lord Mathis spoke first, his words measured and cutting. A king who cannot secure a single bond in 10 years raises questions about stability, about judgment, about whether personal deficiencies might affect governance. They framed Alaric's solitude as defiance, his restraint as weakness, his refusal to force a match as dereliction of duty. The throne required an heir. The kingdom required certainty. What they required was control over a king who wouldn't bend to their agenda. And then they mentioned Mira. The Omega residing in the royal wing without formal status presents complications, Counselor Thane said carefully. If His Majesty cannot bond with noblewomen, yet keeps an unbonded servant in his chambers, it suggests the issue lies not with him, but with his choices. The implication was clear. Mira wasn't just visible now. She was vulnerable. That night, Alaric came to her chambers with exhaustion carved into his features. They'll demand your removal, possibly exile. His voice was hollow. I can protect you by letting you go publicly. Claim I sent you away. You'd be safe. Safe and alone, Mira said quietly. Just like you've always been. Yes.
No.
She stood, meeting his eyes. I didn't survive being property just to become invisible again, because it's convenient for them. Mira. They're using me to get to you, which means I'm already part of this fight whether you want me to be or not. Alaric looked at her like she was something fragile he'd already broken. They'll destroy you. They'll try. 3 days later, the formal summons arrived. A hearing before the full High Council. Public testimony from rejected noblewomen. Evidence of the king's unfitness presented for the record. The whispers had become policy, and silence was no longer an option. The council chamber was cold marble and older authority. Alaric stood before the High Council, silent as testimony unfolded. Lady Celeste spoke first, voice trembling with practiced sincerity. His intensity was overwhelming. I felt unsafe. Not from violence, but from something I couldn't name. Lady Thorne followed. He watched me like he could see every weakness. It was predatory, unnatural for any woman to endure. One by one, they testified. Their words were careful, reasonable, dressed in the language of concern rather than cruelty. They spoke of discomfort as if it were danger, of fear as if it were proof. Lord Mathis summarized with calculated precision. 16 women. 16 consistent reactions. The pattern suggests instability masked as restraint. A king who cannot bond is a king who cannot be trusted with. That's not what happened. The voice cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. Mira stood from the gallery, small and unbonded, and utterly without permission to speak. You weren't there, Counselor Thane said sharply. You have no standing. I have eyes. Mira's voice was steady, clear. And I see what they couldn't. She turned to face the council fully. They weren't afraid of what he would do. They were afraid of what he would not. She let the words settle. He wouldn't manipulate, wouldn't perform dominance to make them feel safe, wouldn't become smaller to match their expectations. They wanted control disguised as protection, and he refused to lie. Silence descended like sudden snow. Being seen by someone who cannot be controlled by your fear is uncomfortable, Mira continued. But discomfort is not danger. And your need to manage him doesn't make him unstable. It makes you afraid. Alaric's eyes met hers across the chamber. She was choosing him.
Publicly.
Irrevocably. The council sat divided, some faces tight with anger, others thoughtful, uncertain. The vote would not be unanimous. Alaric rose slowly, and the chamber stilled. "You want me to prove dominance," he said, his voice carrying without force. "To assert control in ways you find familiar, comfortable." He paused. "I won't." Lord Mathis leaned forward. "Your Majesty, this hearing requires. I learned to make myself smaller when I was 12. Alaric's words cut clean. Not because I was ashamed, but because a tutor flinched when I stood too quickly. Because I understood that my existence made people uncomfortable, and I believed their comfort mattered more than my truth." He looked at each council member in turn. Every woman who left did so, because I refused to perform the role they expected. They wanted dominance that could be controlled, predicted, managed. What they encountered was restraint that required nothing from them. And that, not danger, not instability, is what they couldn't reconcile. A court recorder stood, documents in hand. "Your Majesty, the records show no complaints of harm. No accusations of misconduct. Only discomfort." "Discomfort weaponized," Mira added quietly from beside him. She'd moved to stand at his side without fanfare, without permission. Just presence. Counselor Thane's face darkened. This hearing was called to ensure succession. "This hearing," Alaric interrupted, "was called because you wanted leverage. A king isolated is a king controlled." His gaze was unwavering. "You framed loneliness as instability because it served your interests." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Several council members exchanged glances, some guilty, others calculating. Lord Brennan, an elder counselor, stood slowly. "Perhaps what's needed isn't a bonding, but reform. New frameworks for leadership that don't weaponize isolation." The words hung in the air. Not victory, but possibility. The kingdom had watched restraint refuse to break, and some had finally learned to see it as strength. The reforms passed quietly, without fanfare. New laws abolished bonded servitude contracts, established protections for omegas, and redefined consent in labor agreements. Change arrived not as revolution, but as deliberate correction. Alaric began appearing in public spaces without the buffer of distance he'd maintained for years. He walked through markets, attended local councils, sat in open courts where citizens could approach freely. The kingdom adjusted slowly, learning that proximity to their king didn't require fear. Mira stayed. Not because sanctuary required it, not because gratitude demanded it, but because she chose to. The distinction mattered. One evening, she found herself back in the corridor where they'd first collided. Rain drummed against stone just as it had that night, torches flickering in the same rhythm. She stood where she'd run, breathless and desperate, into a stranger who became something more. Alaric appeared at the far end, pausing when he saw her. For a moment, old habits surfaced. The slight hunch of his shoulders, the careful distance. Then something shifted. He walked forward without apology, without making himself smaller. He stopped beside her, not hovering, not retreating, just present. "Do you remember what you said?" Mira asked quietly. "That everyone hurt you eventually." "I remember." "Were you right?" Alaric looked at her, and for the first time, the expectation of rejection wasn't there. "No," he said simply. "I wasn't." They stood together in the corridor, rain falling beyond the windows, torches casting light that no longer felt like shadows.
No declarations.
No promises that tried too hard. Just two people who'd learned that fear didn't have to be the truth, and that being seen completely was something worth the risk of staying. The peace felt unfamiliar, but it felt real. Months passed, and the kingdom learned new patterns. Alaric established training programs for young alphas, teaching restraint not as weakness, but as foundation. Control before power. Presence before dominance. The lessons were practical, unglamorous, and necessary. Some embraced them. Others resisted, clinging to old myths about strength. Mira worked alongside reformed councils, shaping policies for labor rights and omega protections. Her voice carried weight not from title, but from clarity. She spoke about being seen as property, and lawmakers who'd never considered the question began writing amendments with her testimony in mind. Resistance remained. Noble families who'd benefited from old systems pushed back quietly. Whispers persisted about the king's unconventional choices, the omega with too much influence, the dangerous precedent of valuing restraint over force. But the whispers grew softer, less certain, as evidence of stability mounted. Alaric no longer stood apart in rooms. He sat in councils, walked through crowds, engaged without the buffer of distance he'd carried for years. People stopped flinching. Some even approached him directly, discovering that proximity didn't require fear. In private moments, he learned what intimacy felt like without the shadow of expected rejection. Conversations that didn't end with careful exits. Quiet evenings where Mira sat close without tension. Touch that wasn't followed by apology. Small freedoms that felt enormous after years of isolation. One night, Mira asked, "Do you think it's enough? What we've changed?" Alaric considered.
No.
But it's more than there was. She nodded, understanding that transformation was incremental, that some battles would outlast them both. The future wasn't promised. It was simply possible now in ways it hadn't been before. And for two people who'd learned to survive in the spaces others abandoned, possibility was more than enough. Years later, scholars would study the shift in Alaric's reign as a case study in perception versus truth. What the kingdom had seen as instability revealed itself as unprecedented restraint. What they'd called defiance was simply refusal to lie. The phrase, "what they saw," became shorthand for a larger lesson, that looking is not the same as understanding, that fear often dresses itself as judgment, and that discomfort in the presence of something unfamiliar is not proof of danger. Mira stood in the palace archives, reading testimony from those early hearings. The language of fear masquerading as reason. The assumptions that had shaped policy. She thought about the woman who'd run through rain-soaked corridors, believing safety required constant motion. She wasn't running anymore. Alaric found her there, moving through the doorway, without the old hesitations. He no longer made himself smaller. He simply existed fully, without apology or expectation of rejection. The change was so gradual he almost hadn't noticed, until moments like this, when he realized he'd stopped bracing for retreat. "Do you ever think about that night?" Mira asked. "The corridor. The collision." "Every day," Alaric said quietly. They walked together to that same passageway. Rain had returned, drumming against ancient stone. Torches flickered. But the corridor no longer felt narrow, no longer felt like a place where desperation collided with isolation. It felt open. Possible. They saw what they expected, Mira said, her hand finding his, until they learned to see what was actually there. Alaric looked at her, then at the corridor stretching ahead, no longer a place of flight or fear, but simply a path. Seeing clearly, he said, was always a choice. And they'd both chosen. And so ends the story of a king who refused to perform and an omega who refused to run. If Alaric and Mira's journey moved you, subscribe, and join this community. Like, comment, and let's keep telling stories where being seen completely is worth the risk. Because the bravest thing we can do is choose clarity over fear. Until next time.